Hi, everyone. I'm very excited today to be interviewing Cynthia, Richie, Terrell, the executive director of Represent Women. However, I first met Cynthia quite a few years ago. I lose track of the time. When she and her husband founded Fair Vote, which is one of the major democracy reform organizations in the country, and the leaders in having ranked choice voting be a principal part of the democracy reforms in our country. But Cynthia is a force in her own right and has gone out and started a pretty amazing organization that we'll talk about a lot today called Represent Women, that tries to give a greater voice to women and the expertise they need to be a stronger voice in our democratic process in the country. And Cynthia has a lot of experience that eminently puts her in a position to do that. She was a field director for several candidates for presidency and Senate and Congress over the years, and has a lot of experience both nationally and internationally related to work in democracy in general and the work of women in our democracy. As if that wasn't enough, she's done a lot of writing. She's written for the Fulcrum, which I'm very pleased to that she does so. But she's been a regular writer for Ms. Magazine and done some writing in the New York Times, The Hill, I think the Washington Post as well. But rather than make this whole discussion about her bio, let's get into the interview. I think the City Biz audience has a lot to learn about democracy reform. So welcome, Cynthia. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to have a conversation.
My pleasure. I guess where I should start is to ask you about that transition. I know you were deeply involved as a founder of Fair Vote. So how did that transition come about where you chose to, and how long ago that you would start your own organization? I believe that's correct. If I'm wrong, correct me, Represent Women. Can you give me an idea of how that journey occurred and when it occurred and something about that?
Absolutely. My pleasure. Well, again, thanks for having me on. Excited to talk. I've been a longtime fan. Nice to have such a great cohort working for a better democracy in this country. So thank you. It was about 10 years ago, actually, that I think Rob at Fair Vote, my husband, had the idea of applying for some money for a fellowship at Fair Vote to attract somebody to research the impact of voting systems on outcomes for women. We had been doing that every year just to understand how electoral systems impacted representation outcomes. But we decided to really focus on women's representation in the United States. So we got a small grant and hired a fellow and had some people at Fair Vote who joined with me on this project. It was a project of Fair Vote for about 4 or 5 years. And we realized that as we studied what seemed to be the opportunities and the barriers for women being fully represented in democracies, that it went well beyond just voting systems. So we realized in 2018 or so that it would probably be good to have a full independent organization so we could talk about things like the kinds of barriers that women face in legislative office, whether they are paid or not, for example, is a concern that we are working on right now, a policy issue. So in around early 2018, I think we applied for and got our independent nonprofit status from the federal government. And then it was about a year later that we got some initial funding that enabled us to hire staff and to begin to really branch out into that wider conversation about the structural barriers that women face as candidates and as elected officials, and then what the policy interventions are to address those barriers.
Interesting. And I guess a timely and maybe obvious question, which I guess I could leave for the end, but I'm going to start with it, is the fact that we have a woman running for president now, the second time, to my knowledge, well, the second time as a nominee of a major party. because I remember the years ago when many women ran. But has that changed the dynamic dramatically for women because of Kamala Harris, or is it not really? Because it's one thing to run for the president, but to run for a local or state office, the barriers are still pretty much the same. Is there any dynamic change?
That's an interesting question. And I'm not really sure. Obviously, I can just provide my perspective. My sense is that it's changed the amount of energy there is around the presidential election in a way that will surely have an impact on races up and down the ballot. That sense of enthusiasm, particularly for younger voters, I think is notable. I was just looking at the polls in today's Washington Post that really show that there are going to be more voters, more younger voters participating. And I think that is due in part to her nomination. I think that the fact that she's a woman is a fabulous complement to that excitement. I think it is true that while that sense of energy exists now that maybe didn't exist 6 months ago, it's also a huge country. We elect more people than any other country on earth. I think there are something like 520,000 elected offices, and it's exciting when those offices are contested, but a lot of them, there's not even real competition happening at the local level. That's another issue that we've got to solve for. We see excitement happening in the state legislatures, which I think is fantastic. And then there's, I think, renewed enthusiasm from a lot of groups that just really want to solve policies. So it's interesting to see how those the public interest groups on one issue or another are really engaged in this election cycle. And that's going to have an impact at the local, state, and federal level.
Well, let me ask you a question related to my daughter or my granddaughter in maybe 10 years. Do you help? And you mentioned how maybe a lot of people just think of the big elections, the Senate and the presidency, but so many people start at the local level, local elections, and there's so many important elections on that level, and you can really have major impact in your community, the community where your family lives and your friends live on a local level. If my daughter or granddaughter wanted help, or other women, do they just contact you through your organization through the website? What assistance do you provide for women who are interested and never have participated before?
Well, we are so fortunate. There are an amazing array of organizations that do direct recruitment and training of women candidates for all levels: school board, city council, county council. There are groups on the right and the left and the center. There are some of the main groups we work with, are groups like Vote, Run, Lead, which is a terrific place to start, or Higher Heights, or Emerge, or Vote Mama is really helping to get moms elected to office at all levels of government. So there are a lot of organizations, and I'm happy to provide some more information for anybody who's interested. And you can find some of those on our website that we work in collaboration with. The real focus of our work is making sure the system is prepared once those women have decided to run and are serving in office. If you will, it's a little along the lines of Title IX, which was a set of policies that ensured that girls could participate equally in the education process and in athletics, and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the ADA, all focused on the barriers that certain communities faced, and then policy solutions to address those barriers. And so that's more the work of Represent Women. But we do have a program called the Women's Power Collaborative, which is a project that creates a platform for those who are interested in advancing women's representation to partner with those working on democracy reform. And I think we have about 150 member organizations now. It's nationwide. And then there are cohorts that have evolved where activists working on certain issues are meeting together regularly, or activists in a certain geographic area are meeting regularly, or elected officials, women and men who care about both women's representation and democracy are meeting together regularly to help make sure campaigns and ballot measures for change are supported, and legislation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another opportunity of a way your daughter and granddaughter could get involved.
Well, I'd be remiss if I was going to ask you about the barriers. I'll get back to Represent Women in a second, but you spoke of the organization. I think it was the Women's Power Collaborative that is connecting women to democracy reform. And you're at the forefront. You have been as one of the leaders well, I'm not sure well before I was involved. What year did you first become involved with Fair Vote, roughly speaking?
We started Fair Vote in 1992, but we were getting going on campaigns for proportional representation in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1991. So it's been a pretty long time.
Yes, well, you truly are one of the original leaders in the democracy reform movement. But many of our City Biz listeners probably have no idea what that means. What does, to you, democracy reform mean?
Oof, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that I've been asked that question before, so I'm going to have to cobble together a good answer. I think in my mind, the goal and value of a democracy is when voters, wherever they live, have a meaningful vote, and a vote that impacts representation outcomes, and that voters have the power to do so in every election. And that means we need more competitive elections. We need elections where votes translate into representation effectively. And I think the goal of that is not just counting up, do we have a balanced number of Democrats and Republicans and men and women and young people and older people? But it's, I think the measure of that is effective policy and solutions that seem to reflect the will of the majority. So to my mind, that's the ultimate goal, is to have a functional democracy where everybody's voices are heard, everybody has a seat at the table, and voters have real power to impact who's speaking for them in these representative assemblies. Now, the specifics of that happen to be that we live in probably the world's oldest democracy, which has some plus sides, but also means we've been around for so long and we haven't done a great job at updating our rules and processes. So a lot of the work that I think Fair Vote and now other organizations are doing are helping to catch up to a place the more recently established democracies have already arrived. They have systems of proportional representation. They've figured out how to have universal voter registration, so it's an opt-out system, not an opt-in system. They have federal agencies that administer elections, and there's open source software. All those kinds of things seem to me to be necessary updates to a super antiquated set of rules and practices that we inherited from the UK. And it's no surprise that both the UK and Canada, I think, are still challenged by some of the same electoral barriers that we are as Americans, in that we don't have very high turnout or rates of participation because voters don't have very much real power to influence outcomes, meaning there's lots of diversity in the states. There's lots happening in the states, but in this presidential election, I can't remember what the number of states that really matter right now in the presidential election is, 7 states? That means that a lot of voters in a lot of states don't really have a meaningful vote in arguably one of the most important elections in our lifetime. So that seems like a sobering reality. And fortunately, it's something we can fix, but we've really got to focus on fixing it.
Well, as you reflect back, and I'll get back to Represent Women in a moment, but of your 20, 30 years in this democracy reform work, have you seen dramatic changes just in the nature of that entity itself? I mean, has it grown substantially? Do you feel as a entity, and not any individual group, not Fair Vote or Issue One or Unite America, but as a entity, do you think it's gaining momentum, or do you think we're just at the nascent early stage?
I would say 100% or 1,000%, though I don't like to exaggerate. I mean, it used to be, there's a funny story that my husband, Rob Richie, and I were invited by the campaign for proportional representation in New Zealand to go tour the country in 1993. And we were invited as the representatives of the movement for proportional representation at that point in the United States. And we had to admit, we think we might have been the only people in the movement for proportional representation, or one of just a handful of people working for proportional representation and voting system reform at that point. I think there were certainly academics and others who were students of voting systems and electoral systems, but I wouldn't say there was really a movement to change our electoral systems, whether that's the electoral college or the winner-take-all voting system, until Fair Vote started in the early 90s. And then I think the great narrative has been so many organizations have emerged at the local, state, and federal level. And not only are there a number of organizations now working, we're all working so well in concert with one another. As you know, they're great gatherings. Some things like the National Association of Nonprofit Reformers come together and we share ideas and we talk about how we can collaborate. And there are a number of tables that are very impactful that Unite America and Rank the Vote and Fair Vote bring together to talk about legal strategies and talk about communication strategies. And so I guess in sum, I would say, yes, a huge resounding yes. And not only are there a lot of organizations, which is great, but we all bring a unique perspective to the work and a strategy. And I would say the great news is that the collaboration is really growing. And I think the proof of that is the fact that ranked choice voting is, I think, the fastest voting system reform in the country. In other words, it's been adopted in more places reliably over the last 15 or 20 years than any other single reform. So we see that as pretty exciting. And I think a heartening thing is that it's been embraced by Republicans in Virginia and Indiana and Utah and moderates in Alaska and progressives in Vermont and everybody in New York City. So, it's not that we are all about guaranteeing some outcome, but the good news is that we are delivering more power for more voters and giving voters better choices. And I think that's really one of the most important things that electoral reform can accomplish.
Well, thank you for sharing that perspective. And I think the City Biz audience, so many of the audience I've found were not aware that there's a different narrative out there of the Democratic Republican narrative. And these interviews I've done this entire year have connected a lot of them to organizations, to helping them open their eyes to the choices out there, whether they're more passionate about campaign financing reform or independent voting or voting rights, whatever it might be. There's a multitude of choices. And so that little history was extremely helpful. We're running out of time. We have about 5 or so minutes, but I do want to ask you about something I read. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you recently had something called the Democracy Solutions Summit. Is that correct? Yeah. Tell me about that a little.
Yeah, thanks for asking. That's a program that we've done 3 years now, and it's a 3-day virtual summit focused on some of the most pressing issues in our democracy, ranging from campaign finance to election administration to winner-take-all voting and ranked choice voting and all kinds of issues. And it's 2 hours every afternoon for 3 days, and it features all women leaders and in the democracy reform space and elected officials. And it's been great. I have to say, it's been well. It's been well publicized, I guess I'll say that, so that we've gotten, I think on a few days, we've had over 600 registrants a day, which is pretty many for a 2-hour session with elected officials talking about election administration, for example. So I'm really excited that we've brought a really interesting mix of women working on change at the local level, from Sol Mora and Maria Perez to statewide executive officials like Lisa Murkowski and Mary Peltola and State Senator Kathy Giesel, all elected with ranked choice voting in Alaska, spoke last year, for example, on a terrific panel moderated by Amy Walter of Cook Political Report. We had Judy Woodruff from PBS NewsHour fame interviewed women about their experiences and their perspectives. And perhaps the most important thing is the focus on solutions. I think so much of our day-to-day, what we encounter about politics are what the problems are, and they are pressing and they're challenging. But what we are really trying to emphasize is the work to find solutions that create more equitable and balanced democracy for all. And so that work has been really gratifying. And we've heard from some of the women who've spoken that they've never been on a panel with all women, and they've just been overjoyed to be in a space that has so many powerful women around them. And so that's been a really exciting and I think successful part of our work.
Well, I love that concept of finding solutions. I mean, it seems so obvious, but at the Fulcrum, we ascribe to something called solutions journalism, and we're trying to inculcate that into our writers and our content providers a lot more. I mean, it's very easy to complain and preach to the choir about what's bothering you, but to really, think deeply and come up with think about the nuances and the complexities and find solutions is a key for moving our country forward. Well, we are just about out of time, but I guess I don't know the best way to end this. Well, how about a vision? If everything you're doing now, got to the next level, how is that actually going to help our country? Like 20 years from now, the ranked choice voting was everything you thought it could be, and represent women. Women were now 50% of the elected representatives. Why would that be better for us? What's the reason for all this?
I think what voters and non-voters also actually are yearning for are policies that really reflect their lived experiences and address the challenges they're facing. So whether those are economic challenges or health challenges or transportation challenges or clean air challenges or whatever those challenges might be. And I think the transformative thing about a reform like ranked choice voting is that it delivers candidates who are consensus oriented and focused on finding solutions. As you've probably heard from other interviews with people on your program, one of the reasons that a number of us support ranked choice voting is that it rewards candidates who find common ground to work on behalf of voters. And I think that's the transformation that we're seeking, is to have a democracy that's filled with elected representatives who've run positive and civil campaigns, who've had an incentive to find common ground with their opponents, who've built that kind of civility into the campaign process and the governing process. And then we have policies emanating from government that really address the things that we need addressed, whether that's more regulation or different kinds of interventions in education. I just think the kinds of problems we have are pressing. And I think the thing we're missing is that elected officials now experience so much jeopardy and risk when they reach across the aisle. I'm always reminded of when, after Hurricane Sandy and then President Obama flew to meet Governor Christie in New Jersey, and they had exchanged a brief hug on the tarmac. And I remember that being like, all right, Republican Governor Chris Christie's career is over, because he found common ground with the President of the United States to meet the needs after a hurricane. And I want to change that so that we reward people and we provide incentives for elected officials to work together on our behalf with no jeopardy. And some of that is going to be mean that there's going to be more competition in races, and that every election that we have around the country is competitive, and every voter in every state has a equal say in the presidential election and in their elections for Congress, in city council, and on down. That's my vision.
Well, we need that more than ever during this incredibly contentious, angry, perhaps you could call it dysfunctional campaign that's happening now. But knowing you so well and the work you've done over the years, I can assure our audience this is not just a pipe dream. This is real. And so any of you folks out there who want to learn more, check out the work of the democracy reform movement in general, or Represent Women, or Fair Vote. And you too can be part of what I believe is a new narrative for the direction of our democracy in the coming years. Thank you so much, Cynthia. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed our conversation.